usually start out with a joke, because everything afterwards is really ponderous and depressing. So that's not entirely true. But I guess I will start out with a joke. Before I do, well, how many people here have read the book? And I know at least one person here has read the book and still showed up tonight. Where are you? What's wrong with you? Stand up and confess in front of everybody else. The reason I asked is the book has a range. It's humor, it's philosophy, it's strategy, it's a whole bunch of different things, because I feel that where we're at as a society right now is at a moment where the most fundamental aspects of finance and culture are being called into question. Maybe not every second. Usually it's just the financial part. But I'm sure you've all noted that sometime in the last couple of months, the kinds of conversations that are being had on the media, they go everywhere. Half of them are like, what's the bottom, and what do we do now, and all of that stuff. But a bunch of them are, is the system broken? What's the future of capitalism? I mean, these words are actually being said on television, which is a pretty crazy thing to witness. So the book and also this discussion tonight is going to weave in and out of, let's say, history, biology, philosophy, and finance, trying to look at, I guess you'd say what we're trying to do with slow money is look at the problem square, face it, not be afraid of it, and try to begin asking some fundamental questions about what we could do to fix it. Not it like the whole damn thing, but let's say a piece of it that might lead us in a good direction. So I am going to, I have a PowerPoint. I want to say before I do, the PowerPoint wasn't designed thinking about this setting per se. We were putting on workshops around the country with groups of stakeholders in different regions. And the stakeholders, I'll say more about this later when we get to that part of the presentation to tell you what we're trying to do. The presentation basically, if you think about, a lot of it is going to be the why and the what. Like what are we trying to do and why? But the how will be at the end. I'll tell you what we're actually trying to do, and hopefully that'll lead into a good discussion. You'll have a lot of questions about how we're trying to do this. So before even the joke, I just want to say a few other introductory remarks. This is the biggest lead into a lousy joke you're ever going to hear. Yeah, sometimes I actually talk for about a half hour before I get going. It's frightening. So I wanted to say a little bit about my background, because I'm going to cover some it's going to go, it's going to be a little bit of a ride through a lot of things about capitalism and culture and whatnot. And I just want you to know that for 30 years I have actually been doing things and being an entrepreneur and being a small-scale venture capitalist. And we can say more about that when we get to the back end and we start talking about how we're trying to do this and what some of the real tactical and strategic questions are about trying to make this vision a reality. But the most relevant parts of my experience that hopefully you'll give me the benefit of the doubt when we get into some of the more far-flung portions of this. I was treasurer of a environmental foundation for most of the 90s. Some of you will know the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation in New York. I'm just curious, how many people here have? Yeah, it was for a number of years. It was one of the major grant makers in sustainable agriculture. I mean, it still is very active, but it's been overtaken by some of the larger foundations. And in that capacity, we actually, it was about a $60 million foundation when I was there, and we actually had the audacity to invest $3.5 million of our $60 million. Yes? Maybe this is probably a better joke than the actual joke that I haven't gotten to yet. $3.5 million of our $60 million we invested in early stage companies that were consistent with our philanthropic purpose. If you can imagine how radical that is. How many people have experience with philanthropy here? All right. So you have some direct or indirect knowledge of the structural issues in philanthropy. And there are, we're going to weave in and out of these issues tonight during the presentation, but there are, let's say, between $500 and $600 billion of foundation assets in the United States. And 99.9% of them, that number you're going to hear a lot tonight, because almost every category I talk about, it's 99.9% the wrong way. And this is one of them. All the assets of foundations are invested without any attention to their philanthropic purpose. So you get like the Gates Foundation invested in Nigerian oil companies while they're giving grants for community health in Africa. And when questioned, they just completely rebuff the question. They just basically, they almost answered it. It's an LA Times reporter, muckraked, brought it up. There was a brief moment for a couple of weeks when it seemed like they were going to respond, and then they just issued a statement saying, we've looked at it, we don't think we're doing anything wrong, we avoid egregious investments in our opinion, and the rest of it is none of your business. We're a grant-making organization. This is not about investing. So we at the Noyes Foundation, actually invested a little more than 5% of our assets in companies that were consistent with our mission, and that experience kind of impelled me to the next stop, which was a group called Investor Circle, which I also want to mention. You'll see a slide or two about it in the presentation. And Investor Circle is simply understood as an angel network. It's not just angels, it's a few foundations and a number of small social purpose funds. But it's 16 or 17 years old now. It's a nonprofit membership organization that has invested over $130 million in about 200 early stage sustainability promoting ventures and small funds over the last, whatever that was, 16 years now, 17 years. So very, very small by institutional standards, but by individual standards and by angel standards, somewhat okay. And that included a bunch of, well, I'll get into the rest of that when I do the PowerPoint. So I just wanted to say this by way of background that, I've been doing this for a long time. That doesn't mean, that doesn't make it right, as someone, once liked to put it. But I hope that experience will kind of you'll follow me through all this and realize that it's not just a bunch of philosophy, that there's some real deal experience there and some intent to make this real. Okay, are we ready now you're ready for the joke. So the joke goes as follows. I just can't get away from this joke. This joke has been around for about 30 years, but as of like 6 months ago, it became renewed in significance. So the story goes that a woman is waiting outside of the operating room for many hours, and the surgeon comes out all bedraggled and pulls his mask down and said, Mrs. Jones, I've got bad news, then I've got some good news, but then I got more bad news for you. She says, my God, well, what's the first bad news? And he says, well, the first bad news is your husband's brain tumor is completely inoperable, as we feared it might be. It's everywhere. We can't just remove the tumor. So she collapses, and then she, after a while, recovers and says, well, I know we were worried. Oh, wait, you said you had some good news. What could be good news after that? He says, well, it's really the damnedest thing, but in this medical center last week, we invented the world's first brain transplant operation, and we have 3 donors available. She says, my God, that's more than just good news. It's a miracle. It's unbelievable. So then she says, wait, you said you had more bad news. What could be bad news after that? He says, well, the bad news is the brains aren't covered by medical insurance, and they're really expensive. She says, how expensive? He says, stick with me. The joke's almost over. She said, so he says, well, the first brain is the brain of a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, and that brain's $1 million. She says, $1 million? Well, if we sell the house and whatever, we can probably scrape up $1 million. He said, what about the other ones? He said, the other ones are even more expensive. The next one's the brain of a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. That's $10 million. She said, oh my God, I can't possibly afford that, but I'm just curious, what's the last one? He said, forget the last one. It's really, really expensive. She said, please tell me. He said, okay, the last one's the brain of an investment banker. That's worth $100 million. She thinks about it for a second and says, well, if the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist is $1 million and the Nobel Prize-winning physicist is $10 million, what could possibly be so valuable about the brain of an investment banker that would make it be worth $100 million? He leans over and stares at her and says, never been used. I got through it, all right. Okay. We are now well begun. Humor is important because it gets us out of the left side of our brain. You're going to hear more about the left. Oh, so I almost forgot something very important. I have to decide when I'm going to read from the book. And I think I'm going to do it now before I do the PowerPoint.